Hey there, welcome back to last video before bed. Today we'll be reading scary Uber taxi passenger stories told from Reddit. One of the last stories really gives me the absolute chills. So, I have a wild Uber story that still haunts me. A few months ago, I was in town for a conference and needed a ride to a dinner event. I called for an Uber and a few minutes later, a friendly woman pulled up in a cute little car. From the moment I got in, she had this warm, inviting energy. We introduced ourselves and she seemed really nice. As we drove through the bustling city streets, we hit it off immediately. We talked about everything: our favorite music, places we wanted to travel to, our life goals, and even some of our most embarrassing moments. It felt like I was catching up with an old friend rather than just chatting with an Uber driver. By the time we arrived at my destination, I felt like I had made a genuine connection. As we parked, I turned to her and jokingly asked if she wanted to grab a drink sometime. To my surprise, she smiled brightly and said yes. We exchanged numbers and I thought, what a cool way to meet someone. I was excited at the prospect of getting to know her better, and we ended up going out a couple of times. Each time was more fun than the last. She was funny, engaging, and had such an adventurous spirit that I couldn't help but be drawn to her. We explored new restaurants, shared stories over drinks, and even checked out a local live music scene. Everything was going great until one night while we were out, I casually asked her how long she had been driving for Uber. That's when her expression changed. She hesitated and I could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before she finally said, "Oh, I don't actually drive for Uber." I was confused and asked her what she meant. She explained that she had just been using her friend's car to pick me up that night because she thought it would be fun to meet someone new. It was a moment that made my stomach drop. At first, I thought she was joking, but the look on her face made it clear she was serious. I asked her if she had any kind of rideshare insurance or anything, and she just shrugged it off, saying it wasn't a big deal. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. I had been riding with someone who wasn't even a qualified driver. My mind raced with all the potential risks I had unknowingly walked into. What if something had happened during the ride? What if she had gotten into an accident? The reality of the situation hit me hard. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I started replaying every moment of our time together, wondering if I had missed any red flags. I ended things with her shortly after. It just didn't feel right anymore. I remember feeling a mix of disappointment and relief, like I had dodged a bullet. Looking back, I realize how reckless and dangerous it was to get into a car with someone who wasn't actually working for Uber. It was a bizarre experience that taught me to be way more cautious about who I trust, especially when it comes to rideshare services. I still think about how easily things could have gone sideways if I hadn't asked that one question that night. It's a reminder to always be aware and trust your instincts. Now, I'm much more vigilant whenever I take a rideshare, and I always check the driver's credentials before getting in. It's wild how a seemingly innocent encounter can turn into a lesson that sticks with you long after it's over. I was in a new city for a work conference and decided to call an Uber late one night after dinner with some colleagues. It was around midnight, and I was looking forward to getting back to my hotel room and unwinding. The driver picked me up quickly and he seemed nice enough at first. We chatted about the city and he told me about some great places to visit. But as we drove, I started to feel uneasy. He was taking some strange turns and the streets were getting darker and more deserted. I casually glanced at the app and it seemed like we were heading away from my hotel. I asked him if he was lost and he just smiled and said he knew a shortcut. My heart raced and I started to feel trapped. I texted a friend my location just in case. The driver then turned off the GPS and tried to engage me in more personal conversation, asking where I was from and if I was alone. I felt a knot in my stomach. Suddenly, I told him to stop the car. I was getting really scared. He hesitated, but then he just pulled over to the side of the road. I quickly opened the door, ready to jump out, but before I could, he grabbed my arm and said, "Don't be scared, I just want to show you something." That was the moment I panicked. I yelled for him to let me go and he finally released me. I bolted out of the car and ran down the street, not looking back until I reached a well-lit area. I called another Uber and waited, shaking like a leaf. When I got back to my hotel, I was still rattled but relieved. I decided to check my phone for news to calm my nerves. That's when I saw a breaking news story on the local channel. It was about a driver who had been arrested for the murder of 2 women in the area just days earlier. They showed a photo of the suspect and my heart dropped. It was my driver. I can't even express the horror I felt, realizing how close I had come to being his next victim. I still have nightmares about that night and always double-check my surroundings now. It was a terrifying reminder to trust your instincts and stay aware, especially when using rideshare services. I have a pretty unsettling Uber experience that still gives me chills. A few months ago, I was out with friends and decided to call an Uber to get home. The driver arrived quickly and he seemed completely normal, friendly, polite, and even engaging in small talk about the city. We chatted about our favorite local spots and I felt comfortable during the ride. As we drove, I didn't think much of it. I got out at my apartment complex, thanked him and headed inside. Everything seemed fine until a couple of days later when I started noticing some weird things. I was scrolling through my social media and saw that I had a friend request from someone I didn't recognize. The profile was new but the picture looked oddly familiar. It took me a moment to realize it was my Uber driver. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe he had a common name or was just trying to connect with me. I ignored the request, but then things escalated. I started getting strange comments on my posts, things that made it clear he was watching my social media. He knew details about my life that I hadn't shared with him in the car, mentioning places I'd checked in at or events I had posted about. I felt increasingly uncomfortable, so I decided to block him on all platforms. However, that didn't stop him. I started noticing that he would comment on my friends' posts, trying to get their attention as well. It was like he was trying to find a way to connect with me through them. After a few weeks of this creeping behavior, I finally contacted Uber to report him and explain the situation. They assured me they would look into it, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being stalked. I've since become super cautious about sharing my information online and always double-check who I'm accepting requests from. While I never felt physically threatened, the idea that someone I didn't know was obsessively watching my online presence was incredibly unsettling. I once took an Uber late at night after a long shift at work. It was around 2 a.m. and I was exhausted, just ready to get home. The driver picked me up and seemed friendly at first. We chatted casually, but then he started asking me some really personal questions: where I lived, if I was alone, and what I was doing out so late. I brushed it off as small talk, but the vibe started to feel off. As we drove through a dimly lit area, he suddenly took a wrong turn. I assumed he was just using a different route, but then he pulled over and turned off the GPS. My heart raced. I asked him where we were going and he just smiled a little too wide and said, "Don't worry, it's a shortcut." Panic set in as I realized I was in an unfamiliar part of town, and the streets were deserted. I could feel my instincts screaming at me to get out. I started texting my friend my location, hoping they would see it and know something was wrong. I finally mustered the courage to demand he take me home or I would call the police. To my relief, he seemed to snap back to reality and turn the car around, apologizing and saying he had just gotten lost. The rest of the ride was silent and I was practically shaking by the time I got home. I bolted inside, locked the door, and didn't sleep a wink that night. I still think about that ride and how easily it could have gone horribly wrong. I have an Uber story that still gives me the heebie-jeebies. A few months ago, I was in a new city for a weekend getaway. After a long day of sightseeing where I checked out various landmarks, tried local foods, and took countless photos, I decided to call an Uber to take me back to my hotel. I was exhausted but excited to relax for the evening. When the car pulled up, I noticed it was a little unusual. The driver was a middle-aged man, and the first thing I saw when I opened the door was a car filled with teddy bears, like, everywhere. There were giant teddy bears in the back seat, smaller ones on the dashboard, and even a few strapped into the passenger seat. It was like stepping into a whimsical world, but with an eerie twist. At first, I thought it was some kind of quirky decoration, possibly a humorous gimmick to attract riders. But as I settled into the car, I felt an unsettling vibe creeping over me. The driver seemed friendly enough, smiling warmly as he greeted me. He even offered me a special teddy bear to hold during the ride, which I politely declined. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was way too bizarre. I tried to make small talk to ease my discomfort, asking him about the bears, thinking maybe he had some sentimental story behind them. He just chuckled and said he collected them because they made him feel happy. I nodded along, but inside I was feeling increasingly uneasy. As we drove through the city, I couldn't help but glance at the bears again. Some were old and worn, with patches and faded fur, while others were new and pristine, looking like they had just come out of the store. There was even one that looked like it had been dressed up in a little outfit, complete with a tiny hat and a bow tie. I felt like I was in some kind of creepy teddy bear museum on wheels. The atmosphere in the car was just off, and I kept thinking about how I was trapped in a small space filled with stuffed animals, all while being driven by a stranger. To make matters worse, as we drove deeper into the city, I noticed the streets becoming quieter and less populated. It started feeling like we were heading into a more secluded area, which only heightened my anxiety. I glanced at the GPS on my phone and saw that we were still on track to my hotel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Things took a turn when I noticed that he had a few pictures on his phone screen of him with the bears at various locations around the city. He started telling me about his teddy bear adventures, and how he took them everywhere he went. He described how he would take them to parks, museums, and even on hikes. I tried to laugh along, but my heart was racing and I was just waiting for the ride to end. The more he talked, the more I felt like I was in a real-life horror movie scenario. I couldn't help but think about how strange it was that someone would be so attached to stuffed animals, to the point of practically turning their car into a bear sanctuary. As the conversation continued, he began to ask me personal questions: where I was from, what I did for a living, and why I was in town. I answered politely but kept my responses short, trying to deflect the conversation away from myself. He seemed genuinely interested, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to gauge my reactions, almost as if he was studying me. The air felt thick with tension and I felt my palms start to sweat. Finally, we arrived at my hotel and I practically jumped out of the car the moment he opened the door. I thanked him hurriedly, grateful to escape the clutches of that bizarre ride, and hurried inside, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. The whole experience left me feeling creeped out and unsettled, and I still think about it from time to time. Later that night, I couldn't help but replay the entire encounter in my mind, analyzing every detail. What had I just experienced? It was a reminder of how important it is to trust your instincts. Sometimes what seems quirky at first can turn out to be a little too weird for comfort. A while back, I was in a new city for a weekend trip and needed a ride to a restaurant I had been eager to try. After a long day of exploring, I called an Uber and waited outside my hotel. When the car pulled up, I was greeted by an older gentleman with a kind smile, but what caught my attention immediately was the parrot in a cage in the back seat. At first, I thought it was a bit odd, but I figured maybe he was just a quirky guy with a love for birds. I had seen some unique rideshare drivers before, so I shrugged it off as part of the adventure. As I got into the car, the parrot immediately started squawking, "Hello. Hello." It was surprisingly loud and kind of startled me. The driver chuckled and said, "Don't mind Polly. She loves meeting new people." I smiled awkwardly, feeling a mix of amusement and apprehension, and tried to ignore the bird as we pulled away. While we drove through the city, the parrot continued to chatter away, mimicking various sounds and phrases. It would call out, "Polly wants a cracker," and then burst into what sounded like laughter. At first I found it amusing, but as we drove through the bustling streets, I started to feel increasingly uneasy. The driver was friendly enough, but the combination of his casual demeanor and the parrot's incessant talking created a strange atmosphere that I couldn't quite place. As we made our way through the city, I noticed the driver seemed to take longer routes than necessary, weaving through back streets and quieter neighborhoods. I tried to engage in conversation with him to distract myself from the bird's chatter. I asked him how long he had been driving for Uber, and he launched into a long story about his life, sharing tales of his travels and experiences. However, every few minutes Polly would interrupt, squawking something random or mimicking laughter. It felt like I was in a bizarre comedy sketch where the bird was the star and I was just a side character trying to keep up. The more the driver talked, the more I noticed that he had an unusual level of attachment to the parrot. He referred to her as his best friend, and talked about how they had been through a lot together. I tried to smile and nod, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unsettling about their dynamic. It was almost as if he was relying on Polly to fill the silence, and her outbursts were becoming increasingly erratic. As we approached my destination, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But then out of nowhere the parrot suddenly yelled, "Help! Help!" I froze, my heart racing. My eyes widened in disbelief and I looked at the driver, who just laughed and said, "She loves to play around. Don't worry, she's just being silly." But it didn't feel silly to me, it felt ominous. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The playful tone had shifted to a strange, unsettling note, and I started to feel trapped in the car with this unpredictable bird and its owner. Finally, we arrived at my restaurant, and as I got out of the car, I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over me. I thanked the driver and quickly stepped away from the vehicle, glancing back at the parrot one last time. It was still squawking, "Help! Help!" as I walked into the restaurant, and I felt an icy shiver run down my spine. I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling it left me with. Even now, I think about that ride from time to time. It was such a strange experience, and it taught me to always be prepared for the unexpected when using rideshare services. I wondered if there was more to the driver and Polly than met the eye. Were they just an eccentric duo, or was there something darker beneath the surface? I have a pretty unsettling Uber story that still gives me chills. A few months ago, I was in a new city for a work conference and decided to call an Uber to get to a networking dinner. The driver arrived quickly and I hopped in, ready to unwind after a long day. The driver seemed friendly enough, he was chatty and asked me about my day, which I appreciated. As we drove, I noticed he kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror a bit too often. It made me feel uneasy, but I brushed it off as my imagination. We chatted about the city and he even suggested a few local spots I should check out while I was there. Everything seemed relatively normal until he suddenly took a wrong turn down a dark, quiet street. I asked him if he was lost and he responded with a laugh, saying he was just taking a shortcut. My heart started to race as I realized we were venturing further away from my destination. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I could always use my phone to track the route. But when I pulled it out, I noticed that there was no signal. Panic began to set in. The driver continued to act casual, but the laughter faded from his voice. He started asking me increasingly personal questions, like where I was staying and if I was traveling alone. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. I tried to keep my responses vague, but he pressed on, insisting that he was just being friendly. At that moment, I realized I should have shared less with him. As we drove deeper into the darkened area, I finally mustered the courage to speak up. I told him I wasn't comfortable and asked him to turn around. He looked at me through the mirror with a strange smile and said, "Oh, we're almost there." That's when I knew I had to take action. I discreetly opened the Uber app on my phone, searching for the emergency contact feature while trying to keep the situation under control. Just as I was about to dial, he abruptly pulled over. I was ready to bolt out of the car, but before I could make a move, he turned to me and said, "You know, it's not safe for a girl like you to be out alone at night." Those words sent a chill down my spine. I immediately flung open the door and jumped out, not even waiting for him to fully stop the car. I ran towards the nearest streetlight, heart racing, glancing back to see him still sitting in the car, watching me with that same unsettling smile. I quickly called another Uber and waited under the light until it arrived. My hands were shaking and I felt a mix of fear and relief as I got into the next car. I reported the first driver to Uber as soon as I was safely on my way. That experience left me shaken and reminded me of the importance of trusting your instincts. I still think about that ride and how easily things could have taken a dark turn. A few months ago, I was heading home after a long night out with friends. I called for an Uber and was relieved when the car arrived relatively quickly. As I opened the door, I was hit by an overwhelming odor. It was a mix of something sour and musty, definitely not the kind of smell you want to encounter in a car, especially after a night of drinking. The driver was a middle-aged man, and while he seemed friendly enough, the smell was hard to ignore. I politely greeted him and got in, hoping that the air would clear as we drove. Unfortunately, it didn't. As we pulled away, I tried to make small talk to distract myself from the odor. I asked him about his day and how long he had been driving for Uber, but the conversation felt strained. It was like the smell was a physical barrier between us. As we drove through the city, I noticed that he kept glancing back at me in the rearview mirror. It made me feel even more uncomfortable. I could tell he was trying to engage me in conversation, but I was struggling to focus on anything other than the stench. I cracked the window a bit to let in some fresh air, but it barely helped. The smell seemed to cling to the upholstery and air in the car, making the ride feel even longer. At one point, I tried to change the subject and asked him if he had any interesting stories from driving. He launched into a lengthy tale about a passenger who had left a full pizza in the back seat, and while I appreciated the effort to lighten the mood, I was still distracted by the smell. I felt bad for him, but I couldn't help but wonder how he didn't notice it himself. As we got closer to my destination, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I wanted to get out of the car as quickly as possible. But just when I thought it was almost over, the driver took a wrong turn and ended up in a more isolated area. My heart sank. I politely pointed out the mistake, but he seemed a bit disoriented and laughed it off, saying he'd get us back on track. I felt a wave of anxiety hit me, thinking about how I was in a car with someone who didn't seem to fully know where he was going, and the smell was making it worse. As we finally turned back onto a familiar road, I could see the lights of my destination ahead, and I just wanted to get out of there. When we finally approached my drop-off point, I was practically ready to leap out of the car before it even came to a complete stop. I thanked him hurriedly, trying not to breathe in too deeply as I exited. As I slammed the door behind me, I finally felt a sense of relief. That experience left me with a lingering discomfort, not just from the smell but from the overall vibe of the ride.